Good afternoon, everyone. What a great morning we had. I want to first and again thank NACDL for partnering with us on this event. It's just been an amazing program so far, and we have an equally exciting afternoon planned for you. And I just want to congratulate again the teams at both NACDL and ILR for putting this together. Really wonderful job. We also have a terrific keynote speaker today in David Ogden, who is truly an authority on over-enforcement and over-criminalization. But before I introduce David, I wanted to provide some perspective on why we're here today and build on some of the remarks from the panels this morning. So to start, how did the Institute for Legal Reform, a group focused on civil justice, become so concerned with the over-criminalization of American enterprise? The answer is not terribly complicated. After all, over-criminalization and over-enforcement in the civil context are both of great concern to American business. Viewing them as separate issues would really be short-sighted. Taking stock of them together allows us to see something very important, that the very same, very troubling enforcement overreach occurs in both the civil and the criminal arenas. They are increasingly two sides of the same coin, one being leveraged for the other. The government is playing a pressure game in civil enforcement that pushes the limits of fairness and due process. And that's what I want to spend a little bit of time on today. For example, they're using statutory penalties in the millions, if not billions of dollars as a club to secure settlements, imposing fines and penalties that are completely disproportionate to the alleged conduct or harm. The punishment often raises really large revenues, but it rarely fits the crime, something discussed this morning. Which brings me to yet another point. The government is using settlement as a revenue raiser or as a way to contribute to their favorite nonprofit whose mission clearly aligns with the government's political agenda. And then, just to add insult to injury, we have the piling on phenomenon, where we see multiple, simultaneous, duplicative investigations by numerous federal agencies, state attorneys general, and even international authorities, all focused on the same objective, extracting as much money as possible in a civil settlement. Even the Department of Justice, senior officials, have acknowledged this. Just a few weeks ago, Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates stated, in a speech now defending her infamous Yates memo, that DOJ's lawyers have historically, quote, focused their efforts on recovering the most money, deploying resources to places where they had, quote, a greater likelihood of bringing in additional dollars. The concept that fines should have some connection to the alleged wrongdoing was unfortunately absent from her remarks. And of course, Ms. Yates's groundbreaking, perhaps even radical memo raises even broader concerns. For example, does its sharp focus on individual culpability discourage cooperation and compliance, discussed this morning in the Bearing Down panel? Will companies and their general counsels in particular become prosecutorial tools for the incarceration of individuals? And what does it mean for preserving the attorney-client privilege? To restore fairness, we believe that we need smarter, rational enforcement that encourages compliance and supports cooperation, a point Harold Kim made this morning several times on his panel. So let's make no mistake about this. I want to be perfectly clear. The business community is not advocating for the elimination of prosecution. We believe in strong and effective prosecution where there is wrongdoing. But we need to acknowledge that enforcement today is more about unjust, back-end punishment rather than front-loaded prevention and detection. So to address these problems, ILR is focusing on 4 objectives. First, we should be incentivizing robust compliance programs to prevent violations before they happen. Second, reform should encourage more cooperation between and among the agencies and the regulated community. Third, very important, the rules of the road should be clear to all parties. We'd like to see more transparency and more dialogue about enforcement practices from the agencies. Statutory clarifications coming from Congress would help us enormously in this area, and we are going to continue to work in that effort, in that regard. And that's why it's critical that Congress include a mens rea requirement as part of any criminal justice reform. All of us in this room are working towards that. It's been a great collaborative effort. And finally, the punishment imposed should have some rational, reasonable connection to the alleged harm. We know at ILR, based on some work that we've done, that the American public is in wholehearted agreement with this point. We're interested in fairness. We're interested in due process and in preventing wrongdoing in the first place. After all, isn't that a goal that we all share? I do know that this is a goal shared by our next speaker, a nationally recognized litigator and counselor with more than 30 years' experience. David Ogden has an impressive record in both the public and private sectors. His most recent government experience and service was as Deputy Attorney General. David knows DOJ very well, having previously served in several key positions over the years. Today, David heads the Government and Regulatory Litigation Practice Group at WilmerHale. So please join me in welcoming someone who is often described as both a great litigator and a great counselor, our keynote speaker, David Ogden. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Lisa, for those very kind words. As you never quite know, and to be mentioned in a single introduction, both as a former Justice Department official and as an authority on over-enforcement and over-criminalization, you're never quite sure how to take that. But I hope that stems more from what I've done together with ILR and with NACDL since my last service in the government, then a comment on my record while I was there. Because as many of you know, I have worked with Lisa and her colleagues at ILR now on a number of the problems addressed in today's program. I have engaged with NACDL and with Norm and with Shanna on a range of these issues now for a number of years. I've learned a lot in the process, and I think we've gotten some important ideas out there. Whether we've actually made much progress yet is more questionable. But I very much appreciate the opportunity that Lisa and her team have given me over the course of the last few years to work seriously with a creative team on these important issues. I thought I would speak today, and very consistently really with the comments that I've heard from other speakers since I've been here, about a feature of the landscape that as a former Justice Department official and really a longtime admirer of that institution has come to deeply concern me. And that is a perception, my perception, that the department and perhaps other enforcement agencies of the federal government have moved away from what I always took to be the traditional bedrock notion that governed prosecutorial discretion there, which was founded in self-discipline about the facts and the law, a search for proportionality, and an acknowledgement of the need for restraint on the part of the government in negotiating pleas and settlements. And I perceive that the government has moved toward a greater willingness to use that leverage, the leverage that it has, to negotiate maximum fines and penalties, what Lisa was just talking about. As I will explain, I believe that shift damages law enforcement in ways that I'll talk about. It drives wedges between good businesses and the government and sets back the cause of justice generally. But before turning to those thoughts and some modest ideas about a way forward, I want to start with some first principles, and again, picking up really on what Lisa has said. I do think it's important when you talk about issues of overcriminalization to start with the proposition she started with. As a society, we need to ensure that U.S. businesses do everything they can to comply with the law, that culpable individuals and companies are appropriately punished, that victims of corporate crime are fully compensated. Corporate crime hurts people, businesses, and the economy. I'm sure everybody here agrees with that. Much of what we've worked together on at ILR over recent years has involved looking for creative new approaches to law enforcement, meant to incentivize more effective prevention efforts, better internal protection and encouragement of whistleblowers, increased cooperation with law enforcement in the event of violations, and greater alignment of interests generally between business and government around prevention of crime before the fact over enforcement of against violations after the fact. Both are important, but the emphasis on the first is critical. At the risk of belaboring the obvious, it is important, as we express concern about overcriminalization, to start with the recognition that business has at least as great a stake in legal compliance and good business ethics as the government does, and an acknowledgement of the important role of law enforcement in that equation. Of course, retribution and compensation of real victims of crime are central goals of law enforcement. But its goal should also be, in significant part, to find ways our laws and law enforcement can better incentivize the best compliance practices and business ethics that prevent crime from happening in the first place, and ways law enforcement can build on the common interests of business and the government to ensure that corporate crime is not just detected and punished when it occurs, but that it doesn't occur in the first place. So I believe that's where we need to start in thinking about this larger problem. But I'm increasingly concerned that lawmakers and law enforcement today aren't really asking themselves those basic questions in that way, or at any rate not asking them enough. As a Justice Department official, both as the Deputy AG and at the Civil Division before that, I didn't shrink from enforcing the law in the business context. But I am increasingly concerned about this new, unbridled, leverage-based way of doing law enforcement, and that it bears significant blame for the eroding of the faith of the American people in critically important institutions, both private and governmental, by which I mean both our country's business community on the one hand and the United States Department of Justice and other law enforcement agencies on the other. On the business side, we have a corrosive perception by much of the American public and a great deal of political rhetoric today to the effect that corporate crime is rampant and that it is the cause of most of America's economic unfairness and social ills. The thesis is that companies would prefer to go on breaking the law so long as doing so is profitable, and that laws against corporate crime are not effectively enforced, and corporate wrongdoers are never brought to justice. And so it just goes on, and we are all getting ripped off. That's the thesis. That popular conception is vexing, obviously. Not because we imagine that there's no such thing as corporate crime, to the contrary, but because so many at American companies of all sizes today are investing more in compliance and ethics than at any time in history. And as a result, by most accounts, American companies are the most law-abiding businesses in the world. A great many in our business community highly value compliance and good business ethics. There's just no question about that. But that gets lost in the cynicism out there. And of course, the popular perception is also vexing because many in business believe that far from getting a pass, they are subjected to over-enforcement and over-criminalization, and so we're here. Now that popular perception, that same basic popular perception is deeply damaging to law enforcement too. The damage is really just the opposite side of the same coin. there is a growing perception by many in the electorate, lots of political rhetoric, that federal law enforcement is feckless and regularly bought off through resolutions of corporate investigations, civil settlements, and plea agreements that are mere slaps on the wrists or costs of doing business. Hard to imagine when we know what the costs are of those settlements, but that's the narrative. The critical point is, all that crime's going on, but the real wrongdoers are getting off scot-free. The government responds to this critique with higher and higher penalties and fines, higher dollar plea bargains, and now with the announced policy to emphasize enforcement against corporate executives, the so-called Yates memo. Yet I would submit to you that the government's perception problem for all of that is getting worse and not better. Now, there are doubtless many contributing causes to this miserable state of affairs. I want to focus on just one, this subtle but marked shift in DOJ's enforcement approach from one largely grounded on considerations of fact, law, and proportionality, and one that recognized the proper role of self-restraint given the department's outsized bargaining power, to a new one based more on leveraging that outsized bargaining power to maximize the number of size of settlements and pleas. My concern is that this leverage-based approach sometimes yields large dollar plea agreements and settlements and accompanying press releases and headlines about criminal behavior, despite weak underlying evidence, including often very weak evidence of mens rea in particular, or very aggressive or unclear theories of liability and damages. Because leveraged settlements and pleas can be obtained despite weak factual predicates and uncertain legal grounds, credible prosecutions of individuals on the same theories are often not practicable. Or if prosecutions are pursued, the government loses them. We've heard a lot about that today, and it's true. Whereas the government has enormous bargaining power over companies and thus can leverage corporate pleas, individuals have more to lose and less to gain from a plea and will often litigate weaker allegations where their companies have already settled. The resulting huge settlements, followed by a lack of individual prosecutions, help drive the popular perceptions of widespread corporate criminality and supine or incompetent law enforcement, unwilling or unable to take on powerful interests. So this leverage-based approach yields not only unjust and disproportionate outcomes, but it is also counterproductive for virtually every perspective. I will talk a bit more about what I mean by this leverage-based approach, but first I want to contrast it with what I believe was once the prevailing approach at DOJ. Traditionally, prosecutorial discretion at DOJ was in significant part governed by the principle of proportionality and this discipline of restraint I talked about. One reason for this was the recognition that we heard Justice Kagan alluded to in the Yates case, that in many statutory schemes, Congress has given the enforcement agencies the power to seek potential penalties that in the mine run of cases vastly exceed a reasonable outcome. Not all defenders, and often very few defenders, are going to be appropriately subject to the full extent of the law that's been authorized. Now, of course, in litigated outcomes, courts or juries are entrusted with fitting the punishment to the crime. But most corporate crime matters are settled, not litigated, resulting in a bargain between the company and the government without involvement from the court, and thus the question arises how the government should approach establishing its initial demand and its bottom line. Now, my experience in the civil division in the 1990s, starting to sound a long time ago now, I guess it is a long time ago now, lamentably, and as a lawyer in private practice in that era, was that the government lawyers generally recognized the need for a proportionate result, one where the facts and law truly supported liability and the agreed-upon penalty was proportionate to the offense. That was the principle of proportionality. And government lawyers also realized that to get to that outcome, they needed to observe a practice of restraint. The fundamental reason for that, although perhaps not immediately obvious, was straightforward. Factors beyond a corporate defendant's guilt or innocence affect how a corporation reacts to an investigation or a complaint. Where potential penalties are extreme, for example, where the civil monetary penalties triggered by a potential False Claims Act allegation total hundreds of times the size of the alleged fraud and far exceed a company's total assets, which is common, of course. Even a low probability of a company destroying outcome can compel a company to capitulate to weak charges. And there are, of course, external pressures on corporate defendants as well to resolve investigations, pressures from capital markets, reputational effects that have little to do with culpability and can compound a willingness to plead, settle, or pay more than the facts and law justify. Generally, the enforcement agencies felt a responsibility to account for these realities in their charging decisions and plea demands. They understood that it is not only the final adjudication or settlement that will affect a company's business, but also the initial charging decision. And so prosecutorial discretion must play a role from the very beginning stages of a case. And in my experience, government lawyers typically checked themselves and supervisors checked the lawyers, not only to be sure that the United States got a sufficient deal that vindicated the law, vindicated victims, and vindicated the interests of the United States, but also to be sure that their overweening bargaining power did not drive an unjust or an unduly punitive one. Now, I suppose what I am calling this traditional approach to be in the spirit of the Justice Department's official motto, which reads, Qui pro domina justitia sequitur. I suspect my Latin pronunciation is weak, but DOJ's website explains that that means who prosecutes on behalf of Lady Justice. The motto, which is on the departmental flags that stand in the office of every Senate-confirmed DOJ official, has an interesting history. Until the reign of Henry II, according to the DOJ website, legal proceedings in England were conducted in Latin. And the English Attorney General would traditionally introduce himself, I suspect it was always a man, as qui pro regina sequitur, or he who prosecutes on behalf of the Queen or King. In DOJ's motto, Lady Justice, not the sovereign, is identified as the client, who prosecutes on behalf of Lady Justice, not who prosecutes on behalf of the Queen. Now, what I'm calling the traditional approach is also reflected in the spirit of the department's unofficial motto, the words that ring the alcove outside the Attorney General's office, and for me still give more meaning to the official one. The United States wins its point whenever justice is done its citizens in the courts. Justice and not the sovereign is the client in these aspirational statements. Justice and not victory is the goal. Of course, pursuing victory for the sovereign very often does coincide with the cause of justice, but the facts and law must support it, and the punishment must fit the crime. Over the years, unfortunately, I have sensed that the department has moved away from that proportionality and restraint-based approach toward what I will call this leveraged bargaining model. More government lawyers appear to take the view that whatever penalty the government can extract from a company is presumptively fair, that the outcome is self-justified by the defendant's willingness to agree to it. Indeed, I have heard it suggested by some in the enforcement community, fairly senior people, that it would be wrong for government lawyers to leave money on the table. If they took less than they could get, then they would be depriving the Treasury of money that could have been recovered. Who am I, they implicitly ask, to give away the people's money? Thus, instead of asking what, if any, penalty would be fair and proportionate in the light of facts and the law, the enforcement agencies seem increasingly to be asking themselves, how can we maximize what the company pays? And because the new goal is the maximal outcome, the government, like any good plaintiff's lawyer, will, perhaps even thinks it should, bring to bear all the tools in its arsenal, press every point of leverage, and make demands designed to drive the highest number. And in the end, if a defendant is unhappy with the result or process, or believes it to be unjust, the thinking goes, the company has only itself to blame, it shouldn't have agreed. Of course, demand and pushback in bargaining process are and always were part of any settlement process, including back in what I'm holding out as better days. By the same token, considerations of fairness and proportionality do continue to inform the government's position in many cases. Fairness requires that we acknowledge that. Many government lawyers, in many cases, still employ rigorous self-discipline and seek just rather than maximal outcomes. I'm speaking here of a movement along a spectrum, but it seems to me that there has been a marked shift. And the fallacy in the new approach is that it fails to recognize the significance of the reality that the parties are not on an equal playing field. The government has the power to compel disproportionate outcomes and compel settlements in cases that it probably could never win in litigation. It has that power. Now, to be clear, I believe the government should never decline to proceed in a prosecution out of fear of losing a righteous case in court. It's going to lose some cases, that's fine. But what I'm talking about is the government's ability to settle a non-righteous case out of court. Now, there are several factors that confer this outsized leverage. Ultimately, I believe the biggest source are these enormous potential punishments and sanctions Congress has given the enforcement agencies. They simply are so enormous, these consequences, the potentiality of the devastating event, however unlikely, that it drives settlement. They push back, but in the end, they must capitulate to whatever the government ultimately requires. Now, the simple fact of indictment is a huge persuader. These statutes like the False Claims Act that drive insane potential or mandatory minimum punishments are a driver. Those, by the way, are going up, doubling the civil monetary penalties according to, under a recent statute, according to a recent regulation. Yet these penalties may not even provide the most leverage in terms of outcomes. Debarment and exclusion are enormously powerful incentives for companies to surrender even in the face of weak claims. Because debarment, say for a defense contractor, is a corporate death sentence effectively. Exclusion, same consequence for a pharmaceutical company, for example. Faced with such prohibitive consequences of litigating, companies have considered it imperative in most cases to engage with the government, to cooperate, where appropriate to seek to persuade that no violation occurred, of course, or that any harmful effects were small, but ultimately in the end to capitulate to almost any government bottom line. The risks of losing are just too high. It is worth a great deal to every company to resolve the enforcement action as soon as possible, to obtain closure and certainty. And the value of that closure and certainty is the government leverage. Now, beyond the extreme potential penalties and the value of closure and certainty, there's dysfunction on the government side. I think there's no other way of characterizing it that compounds the pressure and therefore perversely the government's leverage. And Lisa referred to this as well, and that is this piling on phenomenon, this multiplicity of enforcement about the very same underlying factual issues. Now, it's been the case for some time that news of a possible corporate law violation can set off something like a feeding frenzy on the enforcement side. Multiple agencies jump in. And not just multiple federal agencies, but of course when a federal enforcement agency indicates interest in an issue, state attorneys general, other state enforcement agencies are sure to follow close behind. Now, some investigations warrant the involvement of multiple agencies or multiple sovereigns. That's certainly true. Different agencies have different areas of expertise, protect different values, different sovereigns have different interests to defend. But they've got to be coordinated. Unfortunately, we often see investigations, we still do, with agencies not sharing information, not coordinating their efforts. This wastes both public resources and private resources. And because each agency seeks its own penalty, its own headlines, even if each agency were trying for a proportionate result, and many lamentably are not, there is obviously potential for enormous compounded aggregate total penalties that far exceed the seriousness of the violation, and that's happening all the time. Now, at the beginning of the Obama administration, once upon a time, I was involved in an effort to try to coordinate all of that better. There was the creation of something called the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force, which took the place of other similarly named bureaucratic structures that had attempted in various prior administrations to do the same thing. Coordinate this stuff, share information, work together on a single outcome. But it is obvious, one must confess, that that effort, such as it was, has failed, and as the ones before it have failed, and that need still is there. Now, the existence of large and destructive potential penalties, collateral consequences, the costs of multiple and uncoordinated investigations, none of that is new. Though the piling on may be more egregious today, penalties are going up. The imperative that companies feel in these situations to find a way to resolve them quickly, with accompanying leverage for the government, is also not new. What I think is new in the last 15 years, or at least is different, is the government's greater willingness to exploit the leverage it has and to abdicate to the bargaining process what it had previously seen as its own obligations of ensuring proportionality through the exercise of careful self-scrutiny and self-restraint. As I said, it seems many in government now think the bargain itself, given the defendant's willingness to agree, is self-justifying. Even worse, there is this perception that to take less than the most you can get is giving away the people's money. And somewhere lost in the shuffle is the sight line to what should be, and what I had always understood to be, the enforcement lawyer's pole star, the idea that it is justice for citizens, not victory for its own sake, that government lawyers are supposed to pursue. Now, as frustrated as we are in the business community, I believe this shift in enforcement approach has hurt the government almost as much as it's hurt the business community. Look, without question, fines and settlements are through the roof. To pick one measurement, according to a recent study, corporate criminal penalties alone grew from under $1 billion in 2001 to more than $15 billion in 2015 alone. This trend line shows a steady year-over-year increase, resulting in this 15-fold annual increase in the size of criminal fines. This is not a statistical blip. There is reason to believe that some of these settlements and pleas have come even where the government's case is weak, indeed where the government would have profound difficulties proving its case in court. In a significant number of matters that have resulted in corporate pleas, the government has sought to prosecute individuals, and the prosecutions cratered. More often, the government has not even tried to prosecute individuals. Those failures call into doubt the prior corporate pleas because corporate liability generally follows only if an individual or individuals acting within the scope of their job duties violates the law. Corporations are not, in fact, people too, contrary to what's been said, but they are instead legal entities made up of people. And thus, some agent of the corporation, some individual person, must have the requisite culpable mental state for the company to be culpable. And therefore, if the government does not have enough to prosecute any individual, it generally doesn't have enough to prosecute the company. Prosecutors do not want to let the bad guys off, and they are not incompetent. The more plausible explanation in the mine run of cases is that when it comes down to it, the prosecutors recognize before or after securing the corporate plea that they do not have a prosecutable case against any individual. But we have the corporate plea deals anyway, often with very large penalties, at least in part because one of the department's central goals appears to be generating the most dollars and lining up the most pleas and settlements. Perhaps that is because it is big dollars and lots of pleas that drive metrics in a metrics-driven world. The enforcement agencies, including especially DOJ and DOJ components, make annual pronouncements about new aggregate records of fines and new penalties. We see almost daily headlines about record-setting plea deals, and it does feel when you're negotiating that the next case has to beat the prior one. And one has to concede, if you like efficiency, that big-dollar pleas and settlements are very efficient. The department recently bragged that its $23.1 billion in civil and criminal recoveries combined in the fiscal year ending September 2015, quote, represent more than 7.5 times the approximately $2.93 billion of the Justice Department's combined appropriations for the 94 U.S. attorneys' offices and the main litigating divisions in that same period. 750% ROA is very good, looked at through a P&L lens, which the department expressly invites us to do. Prosecutorial leverage is clearly generating balance sheet leverage. But because this is law enforcement, that should be cause for concern, not celebration, not only because the establishment of such metrics is obviously in tension with the goal of pursuing justice in every case, but also because that phenomenon coincides with a growing perception among defense attorneys and in-house counsel, anecdotal to be sure, but very widespread, that these large corporate settlements and pleas increasingly come in cases with weak facts or weak legal theories. Now, it may be obvious why this is bad for the targets of investigations, but all right, why is it bad for the government? Because, as mentioned, the leverage that generates all those dollars and all that efficiency doesn't work as well with individuals. Their incentives are different, and individuals will more often insist on their day in court. And frankly, I think many prosecutors, lamentably not all, appreciate the devastating personal dimensions of an unsuccessful criminal prosecution and may be more inclined to be rigorous on themselves where initiating charges against individuals are concerned. But in such cases, big corporate settlement and no individual prosecution, the public's presumption is not that the case against the corporation was weak. After all, the public asks, why would the corporation have agreed to that massive settlement, and why would the government have demanded it if there was not a strong case of criminality? The settlement or plea is seen as proof that a crime has been committed, and the perception is that the government has simply let individuals off the hook, that it has folded because it feared losing a good case that it should have brought, or that it has allowed companies to buy their executives' freedom through the large settlements. Although I believe that picture is largely or entirely wrong, it has become a real political narrative, almost as bad for the department as any narrative could be. How bad is it? Well, Earlier this year, Senator Elizabeth Warren issued a report entitled "Rigged Justice: How Weak Enforcement Lets Corporate Offenders Off Easy." The report touches on two central themes, and they'll be familiar if you've been listening to what I've been saying. It criticizes the federal agencies for settling cases rather than pursuing harsher punishments for corporations and individuals in court. First, it says, federal agencies rarely pursue convictions of either large corporations or their executives in a court of law. Instead, they agree to criminal and civil settlements with corporations that rarely require any admission of wrongdoing, and they let executives go free without any individual accountability. Second, the report faults the corporations for buying their way out of trouble through these settlements. Former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich has sounded many of these same themes in his recent book, saying government officials like to appear on TV, sounding indignant and announcing what appear to be tough penalties against corporate lawbreakers. But the indignation is for the public, and the penalties are often tiny relative to corporate earnings. The penalties emerge from settlements, not trials. In those settlements, corporations do not concede they've done anything wrong, and they agree at most to vague or paltry statements of fact. That way, they avoid possible lawsuits from shareholders or other private litigants. But corporate executives who ordered or turned a blind eye to the wrongdoing, meanwhile, get off scot-free. Unless you think this is exclusively a Democratic theme, let me assure you it is not. Senator Richard Shelby, at a recent hearing, said no one in the financial sector or elsewhere should be able to buy their way out from culpability when it's so strong it defies rationality. Ultimately, it seems like the Justice Department seems bent on money rather than justice, and that's a mistake. So after years, and I have a good quote from Bernie Sanders too, but in the interest of moving this along, I'll spare you. So after years of aggressive enforcement and huge settlements, no one is happy. We seem to have only losers, no winners. We have corporate pleas, and we don't have corresponding convictions of individuals. The credibility of business and government alike has suffered. America's standing with its own citizens and in the world is undermined by this perception of widespread corporate criminality paired with feckless enforcement agencies. And the tendency to leverage large settlements in weaker cases, in my view, is a big part of the problem. Now, before I share some modest thoughts about finding a way forward, I want to mention one more reason why DOJ's shift from what I call a justice, proportionality, and restraint-based law enforcement model toward a leveraged bargaining model has hurt the public interest. And that comes back to the first principles I talked about at the beginning. As I said, I think pretty much every thoughtful person should agree that a guiding objective of the law and law enforcement should be aligning the interests of the business community squarely and unambiguously with the government's interest in preventing violations of the law before they occur. The public wins when companies are compliant and ethical. It loses when crimes occur. With human beings involved, some crimes will always occur. And so another prime objective of the law and law enforcement should be to align those interests so that companies unambiguously benefit when they share information about possible violations with law enforcement, and to align them so that businesses help make sure that responsible persons, truly responsible persons, are held accountable. The deterrence generated by the threat of after-the-fact enforcement obviously has an important role to play in reducing violations in the first place. Deterrence is a core purpose of proportionate punishment. But if the business community loses confidence, and this is what I think the key point is, if the business community loses confidence that it will be treated in a just and proportionate way, which is a highly problematic side effect of this leveraged bargaining approach to law enforcement I'm talking about, then the perceived interests of the business community and the government become distinctly misaligned, and the important objective of securing full cooperation in reporting potential violations and convictions of the wrongdoers is dramatically disserved. Excessive penalties and vigorous pursuit of factually or legally marginal prosecutions will inevitably push information underground. It is lamentable, but it only stands to reason that if companies fear, based on experience, that the government is likely to use every point of leverage to drive highly punitive outcomes, they will be less willing to disclose violations to the government. Companies will be less incentivized to fully investigate allegations or create detection and prevention mechanisms that might trigger obligations to disclose. Justice-based and proportionate law enforcement, on the other hand, and concrete incentives for those who cooperate beget cooperation, while leverage-based law enforcement suggests to business that no good deed will go unpunished and thus pushes the other direction. Which brings me to the controversial memorandum issued by Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates, the so-called Yates Memorandum. Let me say first that I sympathize with Deputy AG Yates on several levels. First, she made very clear she would really like the memo to be known as the Individual Accountability Policy, rather than bear her name. And as someone saddled with several Ogden memos from my time at Justice, in fact, one was just mentioned to me recently today, I do feel her pain. To the extent people like the memo, credit is likely due to others, and to the extent people don't like them, well, then you really wish they had a different name. But seriously, the Yates memo is an effort by the department to respond to the criticisms and concerns that I've been talking about, and specifically this widespread popular and political perception that the government is failing to hold corporate executives accountable for criminal acts, even while companies are paying billions of dollars in fines for those same criminal acts. And at many levels, I find myself in sympathy with the articulated goals and premises that are in the Yates memo. First, where an individual has committed a crime, caused their company to commit a crime, then that individual should be prosecuted and punished. Second, the department has a problem that is caused by leveraging that $3 billion into $23 billion in fines. To do it, it needs to spread its troops pretty thin. Leveraging a settlement is a lot less resource intensive than actually building a prosecutable case. But in the process, it really may be that settlement in some cases come and the department moves on to the next case before it has figured out whether it actually has a case or not. That is bad if it leverages an unjust settlement from a company, but it is also bad if it results in an individual who really did commit a crime escaping accountability. And third, I agree with the premise that when a company knows about criminal behavior by its own employees, government policy, as I said earlier, should do what it can to encourage the company to align itself with law enforcement and against the violation and self-report and cooperate. So far, so good. But the devils here are in the details. I know the Deputy Attorney General has said that she considers the early returns on the policy to be encouraging. But what I've said to this point today should reflect why I think there are huge obstacles to the Yates memo accomplishing its goals of greater cooperation and more individual accountability. What are the obstacles? Well, first, the leverage bargaining model will continue to discredit the department so long as it generates huge settlements and pleas on marginal facts and law. Unless the Yates memo, by mandating more thorough investigations, moves the department away from leverage bargaining back toward a justice-based model, and I guess I harbor some hope that it may do a little in that regard, it won't solve the problem, because the problem is the product of leverage deals themselves, more than a failure to focus on individuals. Second, the leverage bargaining model undermines confidence in the business community and the defense bar that disclosures of individual involvement will yield proportional and just outcomes. That lack of confidence deters full disclosure. The department is asking companies, in effect, to trust it to treat their most valued employees and leaders fairly, even when the company thinks that neither it nor they have done anything wrong. The leverage bargaining approach makes it a lot harder to trust. And the incentive for companies to cooperate, while very real, are not made concrete. All of which means that by demanding all information as a condition of getting any cooperation credit, the policy may yield less information and not more. Well, it's taken many years to create this set of problems, and there is no easy fix, but I would suggest a few specific approaches. First, given these concerns, Congress should consider adjusting the limits on potential penalties to reflect the potential for them to drive leveraged and bargain-justified outcomes rather than just and proportionate outcomes. Second, we should encourage discussion about how the department can re-emphasize the time-honored, justice-focused, restraint and proportionality-based approach to law enforcement. I hope that the Department of Justice will consider what policies it can put in place to ensure that prosecutors are exercising their discretion with the goal of achieving justice rather than maximizing monetary outcomes. The department should look, frankly, at its metrics and its systems of rewards and consider whether focusing on aggregate dollars and returns on investment really serves its best interests. Leaders should remind government lawyers to check their flag. The department prosecutes on behalf of Lady Justice, not the Queen's Treasury, and wins its point only when justice is done its citizens in court. As I said, many government lawyers do subscribe to and implement that traditional ethos even now, and these better angels should be strengthened and incentivized. Third, the government should create appropriate mechanisms to coordinate when various agencies or multiple sovereigns are involved in an investigation. This includes information sharing, a clear division of responsibilities, and coordination of the ultimate enforcement outcome. The government needs to discipline itself to avoid piling on and to seek a single, just, and proportionate outcome with respect to every alleged violation. And fourth, we should be looking for new ways to align the interests of corporations, the government, and the public in prevention, moving away from this too singular focus on after-the-fact enforcement. Now, I've written and spoken on one particular concept that we've worked on together that I'd like to raise again here, and that is the notion of focusing on the development of state-of-the-art ethics and compliance programs across industry. Programs that are designed to identify, mitigate, reduce, punish, and prevent fraud, with accompanying recognition by the government of companies that are trying to do the right thing with these types of programs. This would be strengthening and incentivizing the better angels in business, encouraging the voices for compliance to come forward by making it truly the case that doing so is in the company's best interests. Now, we've recently seen significant advances in determining what constitutes a state-of-the-art program, and with those advances, we should be able to move toward a system in which we incentivize companies to adopt and maintain those programs by offering specific and concrete benefits for doing so in the enforcement setting. A House Judiciary Subcommittee recently had a very interesting hearing on the False Claims Act, where one of the major takeaways was a recognition that we now know how to recognize and implement what works in ethics and compliance. I would commend to you a report by the Ethics and Compliance Initiative Blue Ribbon Panel that goes into detail on this score, as well as former Deputy Attorney General Larry Thompson's insightful testimony. The goal is to find concrete ways to strengthen the better angels of our nature in business and in government. And I believe we can move the needle in the right direction, not by going back to the future, but by emphasizing our core values of justice and proportionality and finding creative new paths that enhance prevention, appropriate compensation of victims of crime, and individual accountability. So thank you for your attention. Happy to take questions if anybody has them. Thank you.